So, good afternoon, everyone, to all our viewers and readers. Very good afternoon from Caucus and the Probe. Today, with us, we have Ms. Yamini Aiyar, the former president and chief executive of Center for Policy Research. We are very much honored to have ma'am here. It's been a while since Caucus has interacted with her, and it is always a pleasure to speak to her. So, just a bit on us. We are Caucus Discussion Forum of Hindu College. We are a 16-year-old non-partisan think tank who opines on a plethora of issues. And the Probe is magazine started by students of Caucus back in 2020 with the vision of creating a writing culture and engaging with experts. With the same in mind, today our conversation will be traversing the idea and future of India. And once again, I would like to reiterate our gratitude to ma'am for taking the time out of a busy schedule to speak with us. And without further ado, a bit on us. I'm sure I'm the editor in chief of the magazine. I'm joined by Pushkar, our managing editor, and Rajal, our senior editor. So, without further ado, I'll be beginning with the questions. So, for a long time, you have been a prominent figure in the Indian socio-political and policy domains. I would like to begin by asking how you perceived what the idea of India constituted when you were in your formation and college years, and how has it evolved from then to today, owing to developments in the country and your career as well.
First of all, thank you very much for having me back on your platform. It's an absolute pleasure and privilege to be here and to interact with all of you. And there's nothing that energizes all of us who are now sort of mid-career in the policy domain than a chance to talk to young, energetic colleagues like you who are going to be the future of our profession. To your question, perhaps in many ways, my idea of India was shaped just by who I am, my own person. I'm a half Tamil, half Sikh, essentially a Delhi girl. And in some ways, that combination of diversity of religion, diversity of ethnicity, the cosmopolitan melting pot of Delhi in which I grew up, shaped how I saw this country as this unique melting pot that brought together different religions, different ethnicities, different ways of life, different languages, um, uh, different imaginations of community, but knitted them together in the framework of the nation state. And for me, that is what made India so unique. The fact that there was so much diversity, but that diversity, underlying that diversity, the idea of togetherness, tolerance, plurality, which makes the fabric of who I am, and the fabric, therefore, of what this country meant for me. I grew up between gurdwaras and temples. My nani would bring us to read her Granth Sahib in fact, every day if she could, when we were around her. And as children, we would roll our eyes because it was very boring, and we would sit and me and my sisters and cousins would make fun of the whole exercise. But it gave us a unique experience and exposure into Sikhism, and we would go with her and my mother often to the Gurdwara. And by the evening, I would come home to my dadi, who was in the midst of her rituals, and we would sit in prayer to her gods, and go with her to the Ganesh Mandir, which my grandfather had established near the Hanuman Mandir in Connaught Place in Delhi. The fact that we could have these multiplicities of religion together, and still be one, is something that was very deeply ingrained in me as a child growing up. And to me, that is what is this nation. As India has evolved over the many decades, I have lived through very crucial moments in our polity that have shaped the contemporary moments perhaps that predate when all of you were born, but have had great significance in the politics of today. I remember distinctly 1992. In fact, predating that, I remember distinctly the Rath Yatras of the BJP as the idea of the Hindu identity was being consolidated in India. I remember distinctly the 1992 moment when the Babri Masjid was ravaged and fell, and the Ram Mandir movement that preceded that. A lot of the debate and discourse that I was party to, I was a participant in as a student, both in school and college, were around precisely these questions of Hindu identity, of what it means to be a secular nation, of how different religions can reconcile with each other. Should India be an India with a uniform civil code? What were the implications of personal laws and civil codes in that context? And all of that, in some ways, has reached a crescendo in the last decade or so, as we've seen the consolidation of the BJP with Prime Minister Modi now into his third term. The construction of the Ram Mandir was a pivotal moment, just for me personally, as my political awakening in some ways began with the 1992 movement, the riots that followed. It made me think very hard about what it means to be Hindus and Muslims in India, what ideas of secularism mean. It pushed me to explore our history better, to understand the context of partition. Don't forget, I'm a half Sardarni. My mother's family came from Amritsar. Many of them were caught in the bloodshed of partition, and had many stories to tell of the challenges and the bloodshed of that moment, the violence of that moment, and yet their continued belief in the ideas of Gandhi and Nehru that was so fundamental and foundational to India. So in some ways, I was forced, while I was born into this idea, I also was forced to revisit these ideas as historical events unfolded in front of me. And in that process, for me at least, it reaffirmed and reconfirmed why India is so unique and indeed so great. Its ability to build a collective narrative through all of this diversity, and ability to live with religious tolerance and secularism. And these are ideals that we must continue to fight for.
Thank you, ma'am, for that response. To take 91 as another fulcrum, especially with the reforms that came in and the beginning of coalition, or the further consolidation of coalition governments, people have argued that coalition governments often tend to degenerate into a state of policy paralysis, given the lack of a party discipline imposing a guaranteed mandate for a particular line of reforms. So there are two parts to this question. How do you evaluate this in retrospect, especially since post 91 we have seen a lot of structural changes in the Indian economy, and given the reduction of the mandate that the NDA government received in the recent Lok Sabha elections in comparison to the mandate in 2019, how do you think the next 5 years will play out with respect to policy?
Thanks for that question. I think there's many different ways of unpacking the emergence of coalition governments and a movement back to single party domination, and now potentially back, and now in fact back into the era of coalition. But the one argument that found great resonance in 2014 was a sense that, as you said when you posed your question as well, that coalitions require multiplicities of negotiation, and that multiplicities of negotiation tend to become messy, they degenerate very quickly, it makes it hard to actually make decisions. And empirically, we know that that just simply isn't true. 1991, coalition government. Chidambaram's 1997 budget, coalition government. The peak growth years, 2001 all the way through to 2010, into the 2010s, 11s, coalition governments. When we had single party dominance 2014 to 2024, what were the kinds of economic decisions that we made, and what impact did that have on several parts of the economy? In 2014, there was a very strong sense amongst the Chatterati that strong leadership will push us to bold reforms that will fundamentally move India further in the direction of the path that it had embarked upon in 1991. We'll see massive factor market reforms. You need strong leadership to navigate this, especially as factor market reforms like land and labor now are entering the domain of mass politics. Well, you got decisions that were taken without dialogue and negotiation. As a consequence, they first and foremost broke the most fundamental principle of economic policy making: do no harm. Demonetization, badly structured GST, quick lockdown. No matter how much we may want to, kind of position the story in different ways, the empirical facts now are very much on the table as to how these decisions significantly impacted the informal economy, and in fact, in particular, the rural economy, which then finally begins to show in some of the results of this election. CSDS data tells us that even those voters who said that the most important contribution of the BJP in the the last 10 years had been the construction of the Ram Mandir, voted on account of unemployment. I mean, we see that in some of the early data that we are seeing from CSDS. So unemployment has become, and linked to inflation and rural distress, are critical issues. And these emerged on the back of precisely these kinds of economic policy making that were made without dialogue, without engagement, without collaboration, without discussion, that ended up actually hurting the Indian economy and the average Indian far more than facilitating, enabling, and progress for the Indian economy. Even where this sort of dominance of politics try to engage in deep structural reform, the farm laws being really good examples, the pushback to the farm laws, and the fact that the government had to take many steps back. And we forget that, in fact, one of the first tasks that Prime Minister Modi embarked upon when he first became Prime Minister back in 2014 was an attempt to reform land laws. These were the elements of factor market reforms that enter into the domain of mass politics, by which I mean they affect people's everyday lives. There was significant pushback because this attempt at reform did not actually build in, those essentials of what makes for robust reform, long-term entrenched reform, dialogue, deliberation, taking into account stakeholders, their concerns, their issues, and arriving at a collective compromise that makes logical policy sense. So and where did we end up? We walked back on those farm laws. In my view, they were badly designed. But what has happened as a consequence a few years later is that we're not even able to initiate a dialogue on agricultural reform, which we all know is one of the most critical things that we need. No country in the world progresses without enhancing agricultural productivity. And we are currently in a situation where agriculture has generated more jobs than manufacturing or construction, but agriculture's contribution to GVA remains remarkably static. So there's a huge problem here that needs to be resolved, and to my mind it's very clear empirically that strongman politics or dominance of politics at the national level simply doesn't enable the kind of coalition, kind of space for consensus building that coalition politics required. We must also remember that one of the consequences of the deepening of democracy, which became quite sharply visible through the late 1980s into the 1990s when coalition politics emerges, is that as democracy deepens, it creates sites of representation of a number of identities: ethnic identities, regional identities, language identities, religious identities, caste identities, and so on and so forth. And it is in those different kinds of, and it is this diversity of identity that is expressed through representational democracy, through this multiplicities of parties, that has also created a very, in fact, a much deeper federalism for India. States are often represented by state-specific parties. We call them regional parties, and it was these regional parties that then would come together in the heydays of coalition, when Yogendra Yadav coined the famous phrase, "We are not a nation state, but a state nation." You're voting from the state that shapes what emerges as a national government. In more ways than one, that articulation of state nation created the space for this multiplicities of representational anxieties to find their way into national policy making. And that's really important. It may be slower, it may require a lot more of what is at the heart of democracy: dialogue, deliberation, and consensus building. But good policy is inevitably an outcome of precisely these key elements. Strongman politics gives you sometimes crazy ideas, sometimes half decent ideas, but they don't emerge through a process of dialogue and discussion. And without that, you can't build the kind of consensus you need to move forward. India is too vast, too unequal, too diverse to be ruled by one single center. It can only be ruled effectively through democratic processes. Dominance undermines that. And we've seen this with our eyes over these last 10 years.
All right. Hello. Hello.
Hi, Rachel.
Am I audible? Okay. First of all, ma'am, it's nice to finally meet you. And as someone who's grown up in Delhi, I think the idea of Delhi being a very cosmopolitan place is something that I relate to pretty well. But yeah, moving on to the next question. Over the past decade or so, ease of business has been a prominent keyword in the domain of policy debates, even leading to some justification of labor repression in the quest for the same. What ramifications will such a line of development have, and what are the alternatives where labor repression is not necessarily for the growth in manufacturing?
Well, I think that you've hit upon what is the most critical fault line in Indian politics today, or in Indian economy today. I mean, fundamentally, the biggest challenge we confront is the fact that the Indian economy has grown on the back of services and consumption, not on manufacturing. So our structural transformation skipped that critical middle, which has in most other developing and industrialized economies been the pathway to services. And as a result, India has this really unique scenario where, in fact, jobs and growth remain completely uncorrelated. In fact, there's an important study by the Azim Premji University that looks at this as a cross-country analysis, and India really is unique in this breakdown between the relationship of the relationship between growth and employment generation, and that's crucial. We've often argued that the answer to this lies in factor market reform. The argument being that land, labor, in particular, to a lesser degree, capital, because we've been able to make some reforms towards deregulating capital to some extent, are overregulated. It is what Manish Sabharwal who coined this wonderful phrase, regulatory cholesterol. It's filled with like regulatory cholesterol in a way that neither serves the interests of labor nor does it serve the interests of capital. And we end up creating more informal contracts rather than formal jobs. And to be honest, you see this even in our employment data, right? Like even in the formal sector, you will essentially see increasing number of employment that is contractual and doesn't have any of the standard risk protection products that formal employment usually brings with it. So we've kind of created this almost triple layer or a structure within our labor market where the bulk of labor, of course, is stuck in in the informal economy, in the unorganized sector, and the thin layer that finds itself in employment in the formal sector. When you guys go out into the labor market, you're going to ask for the breakdown of your salary and what goes into your PF and what comes to you as LTA, etc., standard protections. Whereas the vast majority of the small percentage that find jobs, even in the formal sector, the organized sector, are most likely going to have a short-term contractual employment, which offers them absolutely no social protection. So we have. So we have this, and it is no doubt partly a consequence of this breakdown of excessive regulatory cholesterol, which needs to be cleaned up. The question is how and in what form. And much of the discourse that we have built out, especially after 1991, on the question of labor reform, has been very much focused on deregulation to the point of absolutely no protection for labor. And that's a serious problem. That's where the challenges come. If you recall the discourse right after the COVID lockdowns, when the average Indian suffered incredibly owing to the nature of the lockdown and the absolute, you switch the button of the the economy off. And when states came back to switch the button of the economy on and thought that this could be an opportunity to start thinking about labor reform, some of the kinds of reform that were brought in were literally throwing out of the window any kind of basic protections around number of working hours, health and safety. I mean, so we kind of have oscillated from overregulation to complete deregulation. And the honest truth is that the answer has to lie somewhere in the middle. In my view, it's the same thing that happened with the farm laws, that we went from an overregulated, closed market, which needed to be fixed in some ways, which is represented largely in the APMCs and the mandis, to trying to deregulate it in such a way that farmers were offered absolutely no protections. And farmers aren't, blind to this reality. They recognized it, and that is one of the reasons why you saw such a significant push. So we have this kind of complicated reality in which the debate in India has operated on these two extremes: excessive regulation, absolutely no regulation, and in the end, you have a circumstance where you're loaded with laws that don't facilitate labor, nor do they facilitate capital. This links also, by the way, to the previous question. The Parliament did, I think it was in 2021, pass the labor codes, but labor is a state subject, and its implementation was meant to be tackled by states. And again, the absence of dialogue, deliberation, consensus building has meant that, in fact, you've not seen that much progress at the state level as well. And, this kind of comes into the debate on the questions of the nature of India's federalism as well. And now we confront new questions when you see so much migration and mobility, people moving from north to south because of the nature of the Indian economy and its own inequality, all of which needs to be addressed through not quite deregulation, but through better regulation. So what we really need in India is state capacity for sensible regulation, and a recognition that the discourse on factor market reforms, land and labor in particular, cannot oscillate from excessive regulatory cholesterol to deregulation entirely. There's no question getting the state out of the way is not the answer, but ensuring that the state does the right things in the right way, that's the hard work. That's the hard, careful, hard boring work that needs to be done, which frankly we've never invested in. And it is only through this that you will end up with the kind of ease of doing business that we aspire to. 2014, when Prime Minister Modi came, and for the first time you saw things like ease of business indexes becoming part and parcel of the political discourse. At one level, you could argue this is a hugely interesting step forward for the Indian economy, taking ease of business and regulation seriously. But it just got hung up on where are we, where do we sit on international rankings, bad rankings, but international, which really isn't the issue. What we should have asked is, what is it that we need in our current context, and how can we best achieve it? And that is a question of how do you get the regulatory structure right, and that's where the biggest weakness lies.
All right, ma'am. Moving on to the next question. China seems to have caused a second deindustrialization on the periphery, given how it dominates the global market. Some economists, such as Raghunan Rajan and Rohit Lamba, have recently argued for eschewing of archetypal path uh, forwards growth, which hinges on manufacture before moving to the service sector, in favor of service-led growth for India. How do you evaluate this pathway towards growth, given the link between service-led growth and jobless growth?
Well, so I think that there are, this is a very hot debate these days amongst in policy circles, as everyone is sort of going back and forth on this question. But I honestly think that, again, like everything I've said, a balanced approach is the answer. We do have to plan for the future. But to get the bulk of India's youth future ready, we have to start making those investments in higher education today. I mean, one of the big realities of the Indian labor market is that you actually, so there are two parts to it, right? Youth unemployment, particularly those with graduate degrees, is highest amongst the total as a proportion of the total unemployed youth. At the same time, those with technical degrees, the wage differential between those with technical degrees versus those with diplomas and certificates is significant, with those with technical degrees, of course, doing so much better, which is why everyone is racing to give those crazy high competitive exams that I'm sure many of you have sat for, are sitting for, will be sitting for, and end up in the mess of NEET and NTA that has unfolded right in front of our eyes. But at the same time, the skills that are needed for those high-end, top-end jobs of technical education are simply not being generated in our technical institutions. So you still see a high proportion of joblessness amongst those with high technical skills, those with the technical degrees that employers are looking for. Complete breakdown in that sense between demand and supply on the skills end, which is not something that can be easily responded to through skilling missions and creating skill departments inside government, but requires serious and concerted investments in higher education. And that is something that we have just not been able to do. I mean, the numbers to my mind to me are just staggering when I look at the total percentage of those who sit for the JEE main, who get to the JEE advanced, and then you look at the total number of seats that actually are part of the sorting mechanism that government does. It's some 59,000, and you've got 2.5 lakh kids that finally make it into the JEE advanced. I mean, this is crazy. Just in terms of the numbers of kids that need this education versus the number of seats that we have, and then the question of, are we actually investing in R&D and the quality of education beyond just the IITs in ways that make them globally competitive, so that we can actually get to that sweet spot of the comparative advantage that we have the basic foundations of in India. This is a long-term investment. It is the future. It is this future. This is where we have to get to. But then there is also a reality that we are experiencing as of today, and that reality is of serious aspiration and significant joblessness. How do you address today's problem while building the foundations of tomorrow? And this is where we have to think very differently about industrial policy. We have to think very differently about industrial policy in ways that are able to both look at pushing low skill manufacturing, pushing agribusiness, creating basic infrastructure so that firms can grow and small firms can grow in ways that contribute to the home market and not just manufacturing only for exports. Both have to happen. There's a number of basic employment opportunities, even in service sectors, that need to be built on: medical, education, housing. Ratin Roy has been arguing these points for some time now. They make imminent sense. Building out an industrial policy that focuses on this, parallel to which looking at the PLI structure and saying, can we actually think of it not just as product link incentives for the futures, for high end services, but what is it that but are there ways of encouraging production linked incentives in ways that are more employment intensive? Textiles could be something. Then looking at our import duty structures to ensure that we are actually able to strengthen, to create an environment that could replicate some smaller versions of Vietnam and Bangladesh in some parts, particularly of North and Eastern India. There's a whole lot of things that we have to do there. So I think that in some ways, again, the debate in India has got stuck in this binary. Should it be go back to the East Asian model of export, of low-scale manufacturing that is basically focused on export orientation? Should we go into the future where we make ourselves future ready for services exports, not goods exports? But you've got this big thick middle that is sitting there totally unemployed, waiting for something to happen. And a society cannot be stable if you have such a large number of people on a daily basis frustrated. And in fact, to me, paper leaks, corruption, cheating mafia are all basically symptomatic of this very problem.
Thank you, ma'am. I would now like to move on to covering a second theme that came up during the start of this interview, regarding decentralizing power, whether it is at the level of the states or whether at the social level. So the first question focuses on the nature of federalism in India. So to me, it seems that the North-South divide in Indian politics has exacerbated in recent times, especially in the wake of the prospects of a new delimitation of the Lok Sabha. This gets especially vituperative uh, on social media, but elsewhere as well, when fiscal matters come up, since the differences in economic status between states leads to a redistributive element in the allocation of funds by the center. So, given these issues of redistribution, the fact that a new delimitation is necessary certainly to ensure the principle of each vote having an equal weight, but also something that is worsening the north south divide. How do we manage these different tensions while thinking about the nature of the federal polity of India?
Well, I mean, you've hit at the heart of the challenge that Indian federalism has to confront, and we really have to take this extremely seriously, because this is going to be one of the biggest policy fault lines and, frankly, political fault lines that India is going to deal with in the next 10 to 20 year time horizon. Um, uh, in some ways, the creation of this sort of north-south divide is itself an artifact of the nature of the economic pathway that India embarked upon. The expectation always was that growth would eventually lead to convergence, despite the wide differences, even at the starting point between Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and UP, Bihar. But the honest truth is that convergence never actually happened, and in fact, we've ended up in a context where the divergence is even greater. So UP has a per capita income closer to Nepal. Tamil Nadu has a per capita income closer to Indonesia. You've got some parts of India that look near middle income. You've got other parts of India that look like sub-Saharan Africa, and it is inevitably going to create its own kind of tension that needs to be responded to. I think what has happened in the last decade or so is that the rather than finding ways of institutionally navigating these tensions, we have actually created deep distrust in our federal structures and our federal systems, and it's ironic that happened, because if you look at the phases of party politics in India, often it has been argued that the coalition phase, 1991, roughly, well, actually 1989, all the way through till 2014, was the kind of phase of coalition politics which was really about deepening federalism, as you saw these state parties becoming central players in national politics. And in some ways, in 2014, we reverted back to a much more union government, national government, union-centered version of federalism, a unitary version of federalism, as we got single-party dominance at the state level, at the national level. But we also, for the first time, had a chief minister who was, in his time as chief minister, a champion of deeper federalism in the form of Narendra Modi, who became prime minister. And his first articulation of the federal question, upon becoming prime minister, was very much in the framework of states' rights. It was about cooperative federalism, competitive federalism, getting rid of the behemoth of planning commission that for many had become the symbol of excessive centralization of the UPA regime, of fiscal centralization. And it also coincided with the 14th Finance Commission implementation of the recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission that had taken the bold step of enhancing devolution of the divisible pool of taxes to states from 32% to 42%. And this was seen as a remarkable step forward in deepening fiscal federalism as well. And the union government, after some pulls and pressures, accepted, as was the convention, the recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission. So it did appear as though at the start of 2014-15, we were actually going to witness a world in which we will have much greater federalism rather than greater centralization. But three things happened that changed the context immediately. One, I think, which is the most benign in my view, was a little bit of a policy short-termism in policy that risk that essentially threw the baby out of the bathwater. For all the problems of the Planning Commission, it had created within it the National Democratic, the NDC. I forget what it stands for, so it's gone out of my head. But a structure in which politically the chief ministers would come. And there was a site where dialogue, discussion, debate would take place for as part of the discussions for the 5-year plans, as well as the the annual budgetary discussions. There was a dialogue that would take place between the states and the center at a high level, political level, and with bureaucrats to negotiate these things. When the Planning Commission is dissolved and the Niti Aayog comes in without fiscal powers, and in fact that was the logic for why why the Niti Aayog was brought in. The Planning Commission with its planned budgets held all the purse strings. States would have to come to beg, they would have to they would have to present case to the Planning Commission before the Planning Commission would open its case, its purse strings. But absent that kind of site, because we didn't build the parallel site of, say, something like the Interstate Council, we ended up with a complete decision-making deliberative vacuum. So that was a policy failure, the institutional vacuum that was created. The other thing that happened is that politically, the impulse to centralize was just too strong. That has to do with the culture of the BJP, the governance style of Prime Minister Modi, which was very much building its governance into the personality cult of the Prime Minister himself. Not only did we end up with excessive centralization into New Delhi, we also ended up with excessive centralization into the Prime Minister's office, which changed routine convention of how governance used to operate. So the centralizing impulse, which to be fair, all governments at the national level have, but got exaggerated very much by the nature and culture of governance that was promoted under this regime. With direct benefit transfers, this became even easier. So it's not unusual, I've written about this often, for secretaries, Government of India, or even for that matter, the Prime Minister himself, to seek to establish direct connection with beneficiaries via direct benefit transfers, or direct connections with the kind of within the layers of administration, breaking the convention of the bureaucracy being very much at the integrated, where you have state representation at the national level. So in the IAS, if you think about it, is structured to have state cadres, and the Government of India gets the state cadre officer on deputation to the Government of India, so that there is an interplay of exchange between state experiences and what is needed at a national level. That's really where the engagement happens. But when you excessively centralize, you break down this sort of dual accountability structure that had been baked into our governance system. In the old days, when prime ministers had tried this in the past, Rajiv Gandhi most famously, there was massive pushback, and which was framed in the slogan DM to PM without CM. The CM was crucial for this interface. The state was crucial for that interface. And now you have DM to PM, and there's no sign of CM or chief secretary sometimes, which sort of breaks down the structure of accountability. So that kind of the political culture of centralization enabled by technology was the second element that broke it down. The third link to that, also the fiscal pressures to kind of use technology to distribute welfare and centralize, created perverse incentives for the Government of India never to live up to its fiscal commitment to states. So again and again and again, the commitment of 42% of gross tax revenue was never actually fulfilled in the period of the 14th Finance Commission, nor was it in the period of 15th Finance Commission. Decision-making and fiscal purse strings were used. The Government of India used this very unsavory trick of increasing cesses and excise levies, which are not part of the divisible pool of taxes, therefore reducing the total pie that states could have access to as part of the divisible pool, that basically ensured that they got less than the finance commissions had anticipated for them. all of this creates this environment of distrust. The GST, which is the third big structural shift that takes place, is unique and intriguing because at one level, it was actually genuine federalism. States willing to give up autonomy in order to come together to create a taxation structure that was based on consensus, the creation of the GST Council. But when that loss of autonomy is kind of juxtaposed against basic undermining of federal principles and trust, when the government of India does things like increases cesses to reduce the size of the divisible pool or doesn't devolve as per its commitment, it inevitably creates an environment of deeper distrust. And it is in this context, therefore, that the questions of how do you deal with delimitation are confronted with. The terms of reference, for example, of the 15th Finance Commission, which sought to use the 2011 census rather than the 2001 census to determine the vertical devolution to states, the formulae for devolution to states, was the first time when this issue of population was raised. The terms of reference for that, I have no issue with using the 2011 census is probably necessary. But the structuring of those terms of references were done in ways that it was devious. It undermined the fundamental principles of tax sharing, of fraternity that are baked into the fiscal dynamics in India. And so it's actions like this that have created the context in which we see a very fraught reality. Delimitation is politically fraught because states, particularly southern states, are set to significantly lose sites of representation. This could be resolved if we create both trust but also alternative, stronger sites of institutional sites for federalism, where centers and states can dialogue and deliberate with each other. This requires government of India to build trust. But for government of India to build trust, the national government has to do a lot more to adhere to federal principles. The last thing I'll say is that in the last 5 years, we have seen some very egregious misuse of constitutional powers to undermine states. For the first time, in the context of Article 370 and in the abrogation of 370 and in the context of the Delhi NCT bill, have we seen central governments, the Union Government of India, using its powers to downgrade states. You don't downgrade a state into a union territory. You don't use your powers of parliament and override what the Supreme Court has said to take executive accountability out of an elected government. When you do that, you've broken any possibility of genuinely committing yourself to federalism and then addressing these very real tensions that you see. So if the coalition government of Modi 3.0 or NDA 3.0, whatever term you want to use, has to, in good faith, address this very real issue of the North-South tension. It will have to do it by eschewing its tendency to centralize administratively, as I've described at length, politically, as I've described a little bit, and committing itself in good faith to constitutional principles of federalism. Unfortunately, this hasn't been done in the last 5 to 10 years. And I'm not convinced that if this new government will be in a position to do so. Past can't always shapes the future.
Thank you, ma'am, for such a detailed response. Other than federalism, another issue when it comes to sharing power that is very relevant now and has been so, at least for the past 30 years, since the Mandal Commission's recommendations were implemented, has been the issue of distributing powers between the various forms of caste stratification that exist in India. In this in the backdrop of this, how do you evaluate the slogan of "Jitni Abadi Utna Hak"? Does it have the potential to change the grammar of social justice in politics? How practical it is? And how do you see the recommendations of the Mandal Commission as well, in light of how identity politics in the quest for social justice have evolved, and how they sort of shape what is demanded of policymakers?
Well, your question takes me back to my school days when the Mandal agitation was at its peak. I was still in high school at the time and had absolutely no real idea what was going on. But a lot of people, a lot of friends were going off riot to protest, also with no clue of what their politics was. And I happily joined it without really knowing what it was. And we kind of basically grew up in the world post the implementation of Mandal, and saw the emergence of the sort of the Mandal Kamandal politics of the 1990s, which has so much shaped the contemporary moment. I think that one of the most fundamentally exhilarating elements of democracy has in India has been the ability of democracy to open up sites of representational claims by historically marginalized communities, which in many parts of northern India, unlike in say Kerala and Tamil Nadu, which generated social revolutions of their outside of formal party politics, it eventually coalesced into formal party politics and into the electoral landscape. In northern India, it was a practice of democracy that opened up the spaces and sites for democratic representational claims by caste through the sort of caste politics of the 1990s. And had it not been for the adoption of democracy, one wonders whether that those opportunities, those spaces would have ever opened up in the first place. And But at the same time, the limits of that politics also were that it made reservations the center of its mobilizational power, but it also made reservations through access to state power essentially its own end in of itself. And that was where the Mandal politics sort of floundered, I think, and lost its power beyond a point. Once we had kind of reached a certain level of consensus around reservation that was then baked into critical aspects of access to the state and access to educational institutions. There was this sort of what next? And that what next needed to be articulated in a broader politics of social and economic transformation. And my reading is that that articulation never happened. And so, in some ways, what we got in that interim phase was the Modi kind of evolution of Labharti politics as a way, as a mobilizational tool that tried to generate an alternative to the mobilization of caste politics. And perhaps it worked for about 10 years. But that also has now begun to show its limits. Because it never fundamentally addressed the critical questions of inequality and economic transformation. And to me, the two things are very closely intertwined. In India, you see the economic opportunity is very closely linked, as we know, to caste. So social justice, inequality, and economic transformation are in some are completely interlinked, as I understand it. And I think that is where the resonance of the reemergence, in some senses, of social justice as a framing in our polity, in our electoral polity, through this 2024 election, and slogans like the demand for caste census and the slogans of Jitne Abadi Utna Hak have kind of re-emerged. Top, of course, with the question around constitution and reservations being abolished altogether, which kind of were the context in which the UP defeat of the BJP, or certainly significant rebuke of the BJP in UP, was shaped. So I think we are at a very interesting moment where social justice is back in the mainstream of political discourse after a hiatus of about a decade, with old and new actors. You have Samajwadi Party's Akhilesh Yadav trying to bridge a very interesting and broader social coalition. You have a vacuum of the BSP that has been created by the near exit of the BSP. What Akash Anand, who's been reinstated now, will or will not do is a question. You have some new voices in the form of, say, Chandrasekhar Azad's entry into parliament. The Congress also, for the first time, making social justice and inequality, caste-based inequality, at the front and center of its politics. But what's missing in all of this is a articulation beyond reservations. And in some senses, to the my in my my perception is that in fact the mobilizational capacity of reservations also has seen its end, in the sense that people will mobilize if there's a fear to reservation, if there's a threat to reservations as a principle. But are people going to mobilize if you're saying 50%, 60%, 90%? I'm not so sure. What is missing is this broader articulation of what a genuine politics of social justice is going to look like, one that goes beyond our welfare politics, which has become the default in most of our political debates. I don't have the answers, but I can see the problem, because also, if you look at where we are in terms of our economic growth, there's a cross-party consensus around where we started in 1991 and where we are. It's not like anyone is arguing today for radical redistribution of whether the socialist era or something, some kind of Marxism 3.0, 5.0 Marxism into the 21st century. Nobody's making that argument. Even when Congress brought up redistribution and equality during the elections, they didn't really talk about redistribution, wealth redistribution in a in the way in which we understand redistributive struggles of the past. They spoke about it very much as, I'll tweak some taxation there, put in some welfare scheme over there. So it was very much not a radical politics. So how do you think then about a politics of social justice when you have a consensus about the path of the economy? You want to tweak it so that it's open to all, so that you can increase opportunity, but you're not going to fundamentally alter it. And if you're not going to fundamentally alter it, what is your mobilizational imagination? I think that's what is missing, and that's a challenge for the future of social justice politics in India, because it is not redistributive class politics of yore.
As a brief follow-up to this query, since it focused on social stratification in the form of caste, how do you see us tackling issues such as the gender wage gap, for instance, which is still sort of brushed aside or minimized by people who attribute it to issues like differential training and child rearing? So how do we go beyond these issues to ensure women empowerment or empowerment of gender minorities in the workplace, but also in terms of domestic aspects? So how do we move beyond these issues?
I mean, to my mind, I think, look, the most important thing that we need to do is to create better conditions for female labor force participation. There is a very wide and vibrant debate around this question of what is it that has caused the problem where India's female labor force participation is worse even than Saudi Arabia's, and even the minor improvements that we've seen have come from self-employment and agriculture, which is exactly a sign of the degrees of distress rather than improvements in labor force participation. And I think that the answers lie in creating better conditions for women to work in the non-farm sector. And those better conditions will emerge via improved urban infrastructure and via addressing some of the most critical barriers to women's participation in the economy. My colleague Nilanjan Sirkar and his co-authors did a survey of women in tier 2 and tier 3 cities. And the biggest constraints that they identified to women's work had to do with safety and transportation. So I think that steps that have been taken in some states, free bus rides for women, pushing more women into the public sphere, create a virtuous cycle of presence linked to safety and mobility, which will address some of these early barriers. There are bigger questions around social norms, and the kind of marriage penalty that women have to confront. But I think that actually the answers, the shifting of norms and breaking of the marriage penalty will come as more and more women find it easier to go to work. This is going to be a battle of intra-household bargaining within the household. As I see it, most young women, educated young women, and the numbers of women going through now primary school, secondary school, and even higher education are increasing significantly. So the conditions for navigating those spaces, which are going to be both personal as well as political battles, are ripe. And the policy response has to be one of creating better conditions that enable these women who are keen to fight their internal battles, their domestic battles, to come out and work, to allow them to work. And right now, the policy and political space is saying, as tokenism, we'll do women's reservation, but we won't actually hand out tickets to women. It is saying women are a vote bank, they are a labharti, so we'll do khatakat money, says the Congress. We'll do Ujwala and toilets and housing and cash transfers, says Modi. We'll do ration. The women voter is key, but the women voter is only being treated as key largely as labharti. Congress at least was able to, Rahul Gandhi had a very important articulation of unpaid domestic labor as a framing in which cash transfers were being given, which I think contrasts with the labharti framing very effectively. But all of this has to be pulled into a recognition of women's rights. And what is it that, from the perspective of policy, we need to do to create enabling conditions for women to be able to go out to work? So to my mind, if as a nationwide policy, we move in the direction of free bus transportation, that will push more women. Improve your urban infrastructure. Simple things, street lighting. I find it unsafe to walk home after dark if there's not enough street lighting. And I live in South Delhi, which has enough people on the road and is generally safer than many other parts of the city. Just better creating contexts where women and work are closer together. As a mother of two small children, my first concern when my children were born was, can I make sure that I live close to my workspace, because I don't want to be far away from my children and spend time in travel. Can I, as an elite woman who sought those privileges, not ensure that as a policy level we have similar privileges given to young women workers? That means improving the quality of urbanization, especially in small and medium towns, where exactly these conditions do not exist.
Moving on to the next question, ma'am. Several surveys by NGO Pratham, as well as Program for International Student Assessment by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, have demonstrated the poor learning outcomes of primary and secondary education in India. What changes would you like to see in this regard in the immediate future that can contribute to enrichment of human capital?
You've asked me a question that's very close to my heart and a lot of the work that I do. I think that there is no question the challenge of quality of learning and improving learning outcomes is something that should be front and center of any policy debate in India, and it's a national shame that it isn't. But I do think that we have made some important strides on primary and elementary education, certainly in India in the recent past. The new education policy of 2020 was perhaps the first most important frontal recognition that learning outcomes, foundational literacy and numeracy have to be improved on mission mode. To my mind, the first most important step towards resolving a problem is recognizing that you have one. We just spoke about female labor force participation and more generally the problem of unemployment. And I think Indian policymakers are failing Indians due to their complete obfuscation and unwillingness to openly recognize the problem. And you constantly have this battle between sort of government supporting economists and economists who are not government supporting, arguing over this question, whereas it's all those arguments are really on the margin. The facts of the matter are that you have a vast population of educated aspirational youth who are not finding jobs to meet their aspirations. But on learning, at least we have acknowledged that foundational literacy and numeracy are critical, and the Nipun Bharat programs that were baked into the implementation of the policies of the of the National Education Program, National Education Policy, are an important step in that direction. I also will say, as somebody who's been in this field for some time, and I've seen this transition across states. About 15 years ago, it was a struggle to get the education secretary and state governments to openly admit or recognize, rather, and therefore prioritize quality of learning as a central issue. Everyone was busy kind of reaching RTE norms, thinking about physical infrastructure in schools, teacher hiring, etc., etc., and did not engage on priority with the question of, once a child enters a classroom, what are they learning and what is the reality of the classroom? Sachai kya hai classroom ke andar? I think that has changed quite dramatically, and some states have really taken this forward. I myself spent a lot of years studying Aam Aadmi Party's pedagogical interventions in schools here in Delhi, and it really is a important example both of the challenges of reform, but also what can be achieved when, at a political level, this becomes a central priority. The where the challenge to now, I think, is getting heightened is in secondary education, and particularly the transition from secondary to vocational. So the first big dropout you get is in class 9, the next big dropout you get is in class 11, and then class 12, those who don't manage to transition into tertiary education. How do we create alternative pathways of vocational training? And it links back to a very fundamental question. At the primary, at the elementary level, I think there is a national consensus around foundational literacy and numeracy. और कुछ आपको मिल जाए शिक्षा में, at least you have basic reading comprehension, mathematical skills that we expect a child that has spent 5 years in schooling to have achieved. But we still are not clear where we want to go for a child at class 9, where we want to go for a child at class 11, where we want to go for a child who finishes high schooling but doesn't enter the tertiary space. What are the life skills that you need? What are the technical skills that you need? What are the vocational skills that you need in order to find gainful employment? And I think that is the national conversation that we need to start having now at scale.
All right, moving on to the next question. Among the normative disputes regarding the role of Indian state in healthcare services, such as whether it should merely regulate and provide insurance or whether it should provide healthcare services directly, what are some principles that have attained consensus or near consensus?
That's one of the most disputed territories in Indian policymaking. And I honestly think that I feel more optimistic about the possibilities of improving public education in India than I do about improving public health in India. And that's a really scary thing. Here, look, what are the things that we are good at in India? We are actually remarkably good in some aspects of public health, immunizations being a great one. Think to COVID. We managed to do COVID vaccines at scale in ways that most other countries struggle with. Good, bad, ugly, second issue. But as a nation, we agreed with the global trend of the time, which was vaccinations are crucial. We went ahead and we did them, and we achieved it at scale. But we achieved it at the scale on the back of a primary health system and a tertiary structure that simply was not capable of responding. I mean, to be fair, it was COVID, Black Swan. No country in the world had health infrastructure, private or public, capable of responding. But our system was even weaker because we've never actually invested well in primary health systems, nor have we invested well in tertiary health systems. There's an imagination that often shapes our public policy framing, particularly for public goods like health and education, which is that the state has failed, so it is best to get the state out of the way and regulate rather than provide. Heck, in India, your average district does not have a district hospital, a private hospital. Okay, the quality of private hospitalization is not Apollo, as most people would imagine. Most policymakers sometimes make the mistake of imagining, or Fortis, or Medanta, or Escorts. It's pretty unbelievably bad. And we also know that the tendency of the private system to be pernicious is about the same as the tendency of the public system to be pernicious towards the individual, in the context where the individual patient is bearing the bulk of out of pocket expenditure. Health expenditure largely is happening out of pocket, where government expenditure is relatively low. We are at our percentage of GDP one of the lowest investors in public health across the board. I mean, it's a national shame. And what is makes it even more shameful is that we've been making these this has been well recognized from the night Bhore Commission 1940s all the way to 2024. We've been having the same conversation in India, and no one is willing to change it. So, to my mind, the question of private and public is a false binary. There will always be a private system, there will always be a public system. Where the public system needs to invest in India today is in primary health. No tertiary healthcare system works effectively if it's not linked into primary care, and into primary care that is also linked to broader public health. The social determinants of health are a well-known reality, so the two can't be you can't operate in silos. You can't do sanitation and not do primary health. You can't do primary health and not do sanitation. The two work together, and that is the commitment that has to be built out. Of course, also, we must remember that this is not one nation, but many nations in the umbrella of this wonderful nation state. Kerala and Tamil Nadu's health system capability, Kerala and Tamil Nadu's disease profile, given its own demographic profile, is completely different to Bihar and UP. So, where the investments in non communicable diseases need to be made significantly in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, Bihar and UP are still struggling with primary healthcare. So, we need to decentralize. We can't have a one size fit all model. We need a combination of insurance as well as investments in primary care, and we need to have an overarching regulatory structure. There's no shortcut here. All things have to be done, and they have to be done through the hardboarding of governance, which is the missing link in India, in Indian policy discourse.
Well, thank you so much for that, ma'am. It's been rather enthralling to finally speak to you one on one. I just wanted to ask, would you have time for one more question before we ask the concluding one? We'd be fine either way. All
Go
right.
ahead. Go ahead.
All right. So, given how prevalent doomswashing is with regard to AI and the dichotomy of pessimism and complacency, which characterizes our approach towards climate change, two approaches which almost seem to prevent serious discussion on policy and regulation in these aspects. How do policymakers approach these contentious issues with regard to the future of the country and the world?
Well, it's a difficult question because it's the pace of technological advancement is just so rapid, and the transformations that are taking place in front of our eyes. And most of, I think, the policy world is 10 steps behind the technology world as it rapidly advances, and we are still grappling with the implications of all of this in our everyday lives. The strengths and limitations of artificial intelligence are things that we are still trying to unpack, unravel, and make sense of. I think that we are certainly in uncharted territory. It's not an Indian concern only; it's a global question. And India's technology leapfrogging, while it is advancing us in some level and giving us a comparative advantage on a global scale, we are doing it, I think, without really, again, building out those foundational hardboards. So data privacy, for example, is a very big example of how we leapfrog into digital public infrastructure, which we are selling to the world, but haven't really thought about the basic forms of protection that we want to ensure we offer to all our citizens. And slowly, as you're beginning then to confront all kinds of banking frauds, identification theft, etc., its implications on the average citizen are significant. So I don't have a good answer to your very deep question because I think these are all rapidly shifting landscapes in which the policy ecosystem is 10 steps behind of the technology ecosystem. But I do think that what we need at minimum is a concerted dialogue between different stakeholders and communities. We need to be a little bit more patient when critique is presented and when concerns are expressed, rather than dismissing concerns as kind of Luddites who don't want technology to be moving forward. forward, to engage with the possible dark side of technology. It's nobody's argument that we shouldn't be advancing along with technology, nor should it be anybody's argument that India should not be at the cutting edge of technology. But India should also be at the cutting edge of technology, recognizing that technology should be used as an enabler, not as an end in of itself. And that's where the role of the policy community in building the regulatory environment is going to be so critical.
So thank you so much for that, ma'am. And for our final question, it's something which relates to both of us, and you've already mentioned how students are the future. So as students, we are at an age where one tends to be cynical about the future and the status quo, despite evolutionary improvements having taken place in the recent past. One particular area which draws cynicism is regarding the integrity of policy implementation, given the vested interests involved, such as pharma lobby in the healthcare industry. As youngsters who are concerned about the future for India, how do we ensure integrity of policy implementation? And what do the results of the 2024 Lok Sabha elections portend in this regard?
So let me say two things. It's easy to be cynical. And honest to God, every time I talk to folks like you, it helps me shed some of my cynicism, because what you all represent, and the very very incisive and insightful and piercing questions you've raised to me today are testimony to the fact that you are curious, engaged, and keen to learn. And I think the best cure for the harsh realities that we confront in the everyday of policy making is to always be open, always be curious, always be willing to learn, and always recognize that we don't have the answers to the questions. What we do have is a power of careful, empirical, evidence based argumentation. And it's when we lose the power of that argumentation that we come up with truths that we then begin to own as the only truth, which is exactly the opposite of what good policy is. Good policy is policy that lays out the arguments, that recognizes the strengths and limitations of each, that arrives at a compromise, and in the process of arriving at the compromise, ensures that the concerns of different stakeholders are baked in. Perhaps sometimes policy choices will hurt those who get left out. What are the things that we need to do to ensure that we are not creating policy that is infringing on fundamental rights of voices that don't always get heard as effectively? So, to me, that's the first way of guarding against both the arrogance and hubris that we sometimes carry with us as those who bring expert opinion into the articulation of policy, or those who are making policy as well. And it serves us well because it reminds us also that there is no singular truth. There are many truths, and these have to be understood, engaged with, argued through, and a logic has to be followed. And good policy is policy that starts with the last person and then arrives at a final decision, seeking in some way to address the concerns of the last person, even if the policy may not necessarily align effectively with what was first raised by the last person. There will always be compromises, there will always be trade-offs. That's the nature of policy making. But how do you ensure that those trade-offs are as fair and as equitable as possible, as inclusive as possible? The second thing that I would argue for, and in some ways, the 2024 election really showed that, don't only listen to your peers, always talk to the stakeholders in whose name you are making policy. In March of 2024, as we began the election campaign, when media was captured, when a political contestation felt like it had almost been eked out, civil society had been beaten down, any kind of dissent was seen as essentially threatening to the government in power, and dissenting voices were being crushed, stifled at best and crushed at worst. We were only hearing one voice. As the election unfolded, it was the lived realities of people who ensured that their voices were heard in how the campaign unfolded, and finally how the election outcome was presented to us, it wasn't presented as as a resounding endorsement of the ruling party. It also wasn't presented as a resounding endorsement of the opposition politics. It was presented as the voice of the voter is going to keep everybody in check and see where they want to go 5 years from now. Ultimately, it is the voice of the people that is most important. So the democratic process of dialogue and deliberation, which is best kept intact, both by being open, curious, and engaged, but also by constantly going back to the reality of where policy gets implemented, to that world, to engage in that world, to listen and to speak, in order then to carry that voice into what gets made in the AC rooms of Shastri Bhavan. That's the only way that we will at least try and achieve the goals of inclusive policy making, which is a moral responsibility for in India, in any country, for all of us who engage in this process of policy making. As professionals, we use the term public policy professional. When you attach the word public to your professional life, it also comes with a great deal of responsibility. Genuine public purpose is about ensuring that the last person's voice is heard and responded to.
Ma'am, it's been an absolute honor to speak to you, and I think this is what our society was started back in 2007 with the same in mind. We are here to discuss these pertinent issues, and we are glad that we could uphold the ethos of the same with you for 2 years straight. And we would love to host you once again, sometime in the future, be it at the college or for the magazine once again. And it's been truly an honor to speak to you.
It's an honor for me to be to participate in this and to have the chance to hear your fabulous questions and engage with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.